Our daily Bible reading today comes from Psalms chapter 35 through chapter 37. And our daily devotional today here at Carrollton Christian Fellowship comes from the very beginning of Psalms chapter 35. And what we see in the first 10 verses of Psalm chapter 35 there. And in verses 1 through 3, we see that David pleads to God for a defensive action from him against those on the offensive against David. And we see here what David pleads and asks God to do. So David doesn't just plead and ask God to fight for him, but David requests that God take hold of his shield and his buckler and to draw out his spear. So here we see what David does not trust in, what David doubts. David doubts his strength, and David doubts his shield, and David doubts his spear against his enemies. But David knows whose shield is strong enough. David knows whose buckler and whose spear is strong enough against his enemies. And so that's a good example for us, is to never place too much trust and too much faith in our own abilities in order to take vengeance on those who have wronged us. So David is a good example of that for us. And in verse 4, David continues. David continues and asks that the Lord would put those to shame who have done and brought dishonor upon him and to seek out his life. So in verses 4 through 8, David requests and prays for destruction of his enemies and what those enemies have done and what they have brought about. And the key thing here in verse 3 is really great. The key thing that David desires to hear from the Lord. And that key thing is in the bottom of verse 3 here. That David requests and desires to hear from the Lord that he is David's salvation. That's what David requests to hear here. This is the most important thing for David to hear. It's not to hear of the destruction of his enemies. David doesn't request that the Lord come back and tell him or the Lord show him or anything like that. But what David requests to hear, the Lord telling him, I am your salvation. So the greatest thing and the greatest encouragement, even in our own lives, is to lean into the Lord, to seek the Lord, to spend time with the Lord, and have the Lord to remind us daily that he is our salvation. So I hope that this can be an encouragement for you today to lean into the Lord. No matter what you're going through, no matter what you've been inflicted with, no matter what's going on, I hope and pray that you will lean into the Lord, not taking vengeance upon yourself, not trusting in your shield, not trusting in your spear, not trusting in your strength, but trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord's timing. Trust in what the Lord is doing. And just lean in and just ask the Lord to remind you and to just speak to you about how he is your salvation and what he has done through being your salvation. How with David is essentially here not only talking about his specific salvation in this, but David is also foretelling and David is also prophetically announcing here how God is our salvation, that through Jesus Christ we have been given salvation, and that salvation is through the blood of the Lamb. That's the only shield, that's the only buckler, and that's the only spear that we need. That's our only defense, and that's our only offense, is the blood of the Lamb. And so I hope this can be an encouragement to you to just lean into the Lord again. Lean into the Lord today as you go about your day, and lean in and just draw near to him for him to remind you how he is your salvation. There's no need for you to fight and to respond in our strength, in our wrath, anything, but just to wait on the Lord and just to hear. Just hearing from him is enough that he is our salvation. So take care, have a blessed one,